Christians believe in the doctrine of providence, which is another way of saying that Christians believe that the God who created the heavens and the earth continues to rule over that creation and to order its development toward the fulfillment of his purposes for it. And not just on some grand cosmic scale. The Bible teaches us that nothing happens that is outside God's providential care. As the Heidelberg Catechism puts it, providence is the almighty and ever-present power of God, by which God upholds, as with his hand, heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them that leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty, all things, in fact, come to us not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. As Jesus tells his own followers, if you want to see the providential care of God at work, then just look around you at the flowers of the field and the birds of the sky. Every flower's petals and every bird's meal, Jesus says, is a provision that comes directly from God's fatherly hand. Such is his oversight of his creatures. And the same applies to us. To quote the Apostle Paul, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." Did you notice how Paul begins that sentence? And we know. That's what he says, not and we see, but and we know. Because the providence of God is a matter of Christian belief. It's something we know by faith, something we trust to be true, not something that we can see. In fact, there are many things, many situations in which God doesn't seem to be present and does not seem to be working for our good. And yet, by faith, we know, as Paul says, we know that even when God seems absent, or even when we cannot understand his purposes, we know that he is still at work in all things for our good. And one of the best illustrations of that can be found in the book of Ruth. It may seem a bit odd to talk about God's providence in Ruth. After all, compared to a lot of other books in the Bible, God is hardly mentioned, and he never once does anything that seems to show his direct involvement in the lives of Naomi and Ruth. He doesn't send them bread from heaven. He doesn't provide any kind of miraculous healing. He doesn't even speak to them, telling them what they should do. And yet, as I've already mentioned, the narrator clearly wants us to see the hand of God at work, guiding and directing these events that are taking place. Like when he tells us at the very end of chapter 1 that Ruth and Naomi just happened to arrive back in Bethlehem right as the barley harvest began. Or in chapter 2, when Ruth just happens to glean in the field belonging to Boaz. Or through the words of Boaz himself, who in both chapter 2 and chapter 3 recognizes that it is the Lord who is the one that will bless and provide for Ruth. All of these subtle indications and reminders of God's providence culminate in chapter 4, where once again the narrator draws our attention to the ways in which God is working in all these things for the good, not only of Naomi and Ruth, but of his entire creation. This theme is evident even in the very first verse of the chapter. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. You'll remember that Boaz had told Ruth he would be glad to act as her Redeemer, but that there was another man who had a stronger claim than him. It's not entirely clear what laws or customs Boaz is appealing to, but it seems to be a combination of two sets of laws, one from Leviticus 25 and the other from Deuteronomy 25. In Leviticus, the law states that if an Israelite falls into poverty and is forced to sell their land, then a relative should pay the money to redeem that land on their behalf. Of course, every 50 years, On the year of Jubilee, that relative would be expected to return the land at no cost. But in this particular case, because there are no sons left to the family of Naomi, then this relative may be able to keep the land for good, which may be why this other kinsman redeemer was so gung-ho to buy the land when Boaz mentioned it. But there's another set of laws in Deuteronomy 25, which say that if an Israelite man dies and leaves a widow with no children, then his brother should take that woman as his wife and have children with her to preserve his brother's lineage. This interaction between Boaz and his relative is combining these two responsibilities together. But the main thing that I want to draw your attention to in verse 1 is the fact that once again, just like back in chapter 2, when Ruth just happened upon Boaz's field, as Boaz sits down at the town gate and the narrator says, "And look, and behold, this other redeemer just happens to come along." That is meant to be a clue for us. As the 17th century English theologian Richard Bernard observes, this word of attention, behold, calls the reader to a remarkable thing and to a special providence of God in bringing this kinsman thus hither, not as yet called or sent for. If he had been sent for or called on so come a purpose, it seems the Holy Spirit would not have said, "Behold." This then was the guiding hand of God to further this match of Boaz and Ruth. But that's not the only clue that the narrator gives us to help us recognize the providence of God at work. He also does it by drawing attention to the orderly ways that this story concludes. Just think about the remarkable parallels you see from chapter 1 to chapter 4. In chapter 1, two women, Ruth and Orpah, are faced with a choice. Will they pay the costly price required to show loyalty and steadfast love to their mother-in-law, or will they not? One decides not to pay that price, and she's never mentioned again. The other pays the price and becomes a permanent part of the story of Israel. In chapter 4, likewise, you see something similar. Two men are now faced with a choice of whether they are willing to pay the cost to show steadfast love by redeeming Mahlon's widow. One man refuses, and because of that, his name is never even mentioned. He's just called "you so-and-so" in Hebrew. The other, Boaz, accepts and is remembered forever. Or what about the beautiful parallels between Naomi's loss in chapter 1 and her restoration in chapter 4? In chapter 1, she loses both of her sons to death. But then in the final scene of the story, we see her with her young grandson, Obed. And what do the women of Bethlehem say? "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Those townswomen, they're astute theologians. They can see the parallels between Naomi's loss and her now present redemption. They recognize how what had been taken away from her in chapter 1 has now been restored. And not just restored, but amplified beyond what she could imagine. And they know because they are good theologians, they know that such redemption is not coincidental. They see the hand of the Lord at work. Blessed be the Lord, they say. And finally, if that were not enough, the narrator drives home his point by concluding the book with a genealogy. Genealogies are very important in the Bible because not only do they serve often as a kind of summary of a certain part of the story of God's people, they also help us to recognize how the purposes and activity of God transcend the short history of our lives. The providence of God is at work not just in his oversight of the days and years and events of our own life, but in his oversight of the much longer story that binds one generation to another. And Ruth reminds us of that by chronicling, right at the end of the book, 10 generations of Boaz's family, from when Perez fathered Hezron to when Jesse, Obed's son, fathered David. Perez, you might remember, Perez is the son of Judah and Tamar. And if you remember that story from Genesis chapter 38, then you will remember that Perez's conception did not go as it should have, because Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law. And much like Ruth, Tamar's husband died. And Tamar's husband's brother did the proper thing and took her as his wife, but that brother, Onan, he just used Tamar for his own pleasure, and he refused to actually conceive a child with her, as he should have. So the Lord judged him, and he died, which meant Judah now had a duty to her. He needed to provide her a husband, and he told her he would, but he didn't. So in the end, Tamar was forced to disguise herself as a prostitute and entice Judah to lay with her so she could get pregnant. It's a crazy story, I know. But every Jewish reader would have known that story. And when the narrator of Ruth begins the genealogy with Perez, they would have remembered that story and how it was a tragic moment of God's people refusing to show the steadfast love that he expected of them. How fitting is it then that Perez's great-great-great-great-grandson Boaz proved to be the complete opposite of Judah and his sons. Precisely where Judah failed in his responsibilities toward Tamar is where Boaz succeeded. And what was the result? Well, like I said, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David, King David, the man after God's own heart, the man who would bring redemption and justice to the Israelites. That is the legacy and the fruit of Boaz's faithfulness. And not just King David. For much later in the Bible, in the Gospel of Matthew, we find another genealogy, one that also includes Perez and Hezron and Boaz and Obed and Ruth. But this one doesn't end with David. This one ends with Jesus himself. Do you see the providence of God in all of this? This story began as the story of a single family, a family who experienced devastating loss, a woman whose life had once been sweet and yet turned bitter, a woman who had come to believe that God had turned against her. And yet what we discover in chapter 4 is not only how God has brought restoration to this one woman, but how he has in fact been at work throughout the entire story, from all the happenstance meetings, the happenstance meeting of a Moabite widow and an Israelite landowner, to the happenstance appearance of that unnamed kinsman redeemer at the gate. Through all of these ordinary and seemingly unremarkable events, the fatherly hand of God has been present, working all these things together for good. And not just Naomi's good, and Ruth's good, and Boaz's good, but for the good of the entire human race. The conclusion of Ruth is as satisfying a conclusion as you could imagine. Everything has come full circle. From Naomi's grief to her immense gladness, from the faithlessness of Judah to the faithfulness of Boaz. This ending, as Sinclair Ferguson observes, it gives us a satisfying sense of completeness and orderliness, of God restoring the fractured disorder of life, putting the finishing touches to his work, and bringing his purposes to completion to his own satisfaction. And of course, what we learn in the story of Ruth doesn't just apply to Ruth, it applies to us as well. For, as Paul says, we know, by faith, we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. We know that God is providential in our own lives, just as much as he was in the lives of Naomi and Ruth. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned the Heidelberg Catechism and what it has to say in question 27 about God's providence. I'd like to end with what it says in the following question, because I think it pertains to Ruth as well. In question 28, after describing divine providence, the Heidelberg asks, what does it benefit us to know that God has created all things and still upholds them by his providence? And it answers that by knowing this, we can be patient in adversity, thankful in prosperity, and with a view to the future, we can have a firm confidence in our faithful God and Father that no creature shall separate us from his love, for all creatures are so completely in his hand that without his will they cannot so much as move. The story of Ruth is a story of two admirable women and how they cared for one another in the face of incredible adversity. It's a love story of a worthy Israelite man who showed kindness and steadfast love to an equally worthy Moabite woman. But at the end of the day, what we discover is that above all, the story of Ruth is the story of a providential God who is constantly at work, even when he is unseen and unheard, and whose fatherly care is always working to bring about good for those whom he loves. This is the story of Ruth.